In just 5 minutes, the judge mocked Jasmine Crockett's law degree, fined her $1,000, and all but handed Whoopi Goldberg a $25,000 win without even reviewing the evidence. But what he didn't know was that Jasmine came armed with a hidden recording, 3 Supreme Court rulings, and a strategy that would dismantle his authority in front of a live audience. What was on that recording that made a federal judge nearly lose his robe and made Whoopi regret ever filing the lawsuit? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. 6 a.m., Washington, D.C. The streets shimmered with last night's rain as a pale light crept over the Capitol. Inside a modest apartment 6 blocks from the White House, Jasmine Crockett stood still, coffee in hand, eyes locked on the dome ahead. At 27, the youngest press secretary in White House history would walk into federal court alone, armed only with truth. Her words had been twisted, turned into weapons, and now she stood accused not for what she said, but for what they claimed she meant. It started with a sentence, just 12 words, spoken in the middle of a fiscal press briefing meant to highlight proposed budget cuts. Extremist programming, she said, doesn't deserve taxpayer funding. Not a name, not a show, no direct reference to anyone. But those 12 words detonated like a bomb. Within hours, the media twisted her remarks into a targeted attack against The View, a program known for its progressive commentary and, by association, Whoopi Goldberg. Twitter erupted. Headlines screamed, "White House declares war on Whoopi. Jasmine targets women of color. Defund The View. Legal lines crossed." She didn't flinch, but the storm grew. Then came the lawsuit. $25,000 in damages, filed personally by Whoopi Goldberg, claiming defamation, reputational harm, and targeted malice. It wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a message. They weren't just coming for her job. They were coming for her credibility, her future, and the principle that public servants still had the right to speak uncomfortable truths without being publicly executed for it. Inside the West Wing, the pressure came fast, and it came from all sides. Senior advisors circled Jasmine like sharks scenting blood, their voices low, urgent, calculating. "Just issue a clarification," one said, tapping his pen against a memo. "A soft apology, not even an admission, just something diplomatic." To them, it was politics as usual. Avoid the optics, manage the press cycle, sacrifice the individual for the survival of the institution. They didn't care that she'd told the truth. They didn't care that the lawsuit distorted her intent. What they cared about was minimizing fallout, containing headlines, and keeping donors happy. Jasmine listened in silence, arms crossed, back straight, jaw set. They thought she'd cave. They mistook youth for weakness. But when she finally spoke, her voice cut through the air like glass. "I'm not apologizing for something I didn't say, and I'm not surrendering to a lie." The room went still. Someone scoffed. Another rolled his eyes. One advisor muttered, "This is career suicide." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She'd already made her decision. No high-priced legal team. No settlement behind closed doors. She would walk into that courtroom alone, armed only with case law, transcripts, and the Constitution. It wasn't pride. It wasn't arrogance. It was principle. "If I back down now," she told them, "I give every public official a reason to stay silent the next time the mob demands obedience. I won't be part of that." She picked up her briefing binder, turned toward the door, and left the room without another word, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence and a White House that had just realized its youngest voice was also its most unbreakable. The courtroom was electric, pulsing with tension even before the gavel dropped. Every bench was filled, not just with spectators, but with people who came armed with agendas. News anchors and press agents jockeyed for the best vantage points, microphones hidden beneath blazers, phones recording even the smallest movement. One side of the room, Whoopi's side, buzzed with barely restrained outrage. "Smear campaign," one activist whispered. "Racist dog whistle," muttered another. Hand-painted signs reading "No more attacks on black women" had been confiscated at the door, but not forgotten. Every glance toward Jasmine carried a silent accusation, as if her presence alone was an offense. The other side, fewer in number, quieter in tone, watched with cautious detachment. Constitutional lawyers, free speech defenders, a few ex-military jurists, men who didn't cheer, didn't boo, but took notes like they were building a case for history. Jasmine entered without flinching. Her heels echoed like gunshots across the marbled floor, the only sound in a room thick with judgment. She carried nothing but a slim black folder, a single pen, and the kind of composure that only comes from walking straight into fire before and surviving. Her eyes scanned the gallery but didn't linger. She wasn't there to win anyone's approval. She was there to stand alone. She knew it. Then the doors opened and the air shifted. He entered like a ghost from a darker era of justice. Judge Edward Grayson, robed in authority, arrogance, and a reputation so infamous it preceded him like smoke before fire. 63 years old, steel-rimmed glasses, a jaw carved from granite. He didn't look at the court. He inspected it, like a general surveying inferior troops. His eyes finally landed on Jasmine, and for a split second, they narrowed with something that wasn't curiosity. It was disdain. Not the kind you show to someone dangerous. The kind you show to someone you think doesn't belong. He sat slowly, deliberately, as if the act of taking his seat was itself a proclamation. This is my arena, my rules, and you, little girl, are already out of your depth. Then in a tone laced with ice, he spoke. The court will now hear Goldberg versus Crockett, though I must admit I didn't expect to preside over a press conference this morning. A ripple of laughter stirred from the plaintiff's side. Jasmine didn't blink. Grayson continued, this time leaning forward, voice sharpened to a point. Miss Crockett, I assume you've waived counsel not because you couldn't find one, but because you believe yourself qualified to challenge tenets of defamation law by instinct? Gasps flickered through the room. One reporter scribbled fast, underlining the phrase, by instinct. Jasmine stood slowly. No, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady. I waived counsel because I trust the law more than I trust perception. The judge stared at her like she'd just insulted his legacy. We'll see how long that trust lasts once we begin, he muttered. And then he banged the gavel hard, sending a sound cracking through the courtroom like a warning shot. The message was clear. This wasn't going to be a fair fight, and he had no intention of pretending otherwise. Grayson's gavel still echoed through the courtroom like a warning shot when Daniel Hirsch rose from the plaintiff's table. The judge didn't need to introduce him. His reputation entered the room 5 years before he did. Hirsch moved with calm deliberation, exuding the polished confidence of a man who'd brought Fortune 500 CEOs and former senators to their knees without ever raising his voice. He turned toward the bench with a calculated nod, then toward the jury box, where even the gallery fell silent. Jasmine didn't move. She recognized the type, a man who didn't argue cases. He constructed narratives, piece by lethal piece. Your Honor, Hirsch began, tone measured but laced with quiet fire. This case is not about opinion. It's about destruction, of a legacy, of a career, of a woman who has stood at the forefront of American media and civil rights for over 4 decades. He placed both hands on the lectern and let the silence stretch, then delivered the first strike. Ms. Whoopi Goldberg has dedicated her life to the very principle that voices should not be silenced. But now, ironically, she has become the target of a reckless voice, one backed not just by influence, but by government authority. He lifted a printed chart, holding it up for the judge. Following the defendant's statement, The View experienced a 12.4% drop in weekly ad revenue. That translates to over $250,000 in lost sponsorships in just the first 2 weeks. Long-standing contracts gone. A second binder hit the table with a loud thud, sending a jolt through the courtroom. Here are written notices from 3 national brands pulling out, not because of The View's content, but because they didn't want their name associated with what they described as a government-flagged extremist program. Her words, Your Honor, delivered behind the White House seal. He turned now, eyes narrowing, voice growing colder. And let's not pretend the damage ended there. We have over 18,000 public social media posts, tweets, videos, even viral memes, mocking, threatening, and defaming Ms. Goldberg, many of them directly citing the defendant's phrase, extremist programming. He paused, flipping to one particularly vile example on a slide, a caricature of Whoopi with the words taxpayer leech pasted across her forehead. Audible gasps stirred from the gallery. Hirsch faced the judge again. This was not political discourse. This was a targeted strike. The defendant knew her words would carry weight. She knew they would land like missiles, and she launched them anyway. He spoke that last line while locking eyes with Jasmine, as if daring her to respond. But she didn't. She remained still, composed, controlled. Her jaw tight, her fingers interlocked so tightly the knuckles whitened, but her gaze never dropped. Judge Grayson, meanwhile, was an open book. He leaned forward, nodding slowly, his pen moving across the notepad with rhythmic satisfaction. His smile curled, not wide but visible. Once he even chuckled under his breath and murmured, "Compelling," loud enough for the court clerk to hear. To any objective observer, the imbalance was jarring. Every anecdote, every tweet, every fluctuation in ad revenue was being treated as hard evidence of malicious intent. No one questioned the cause. No one mentioned the First Amendment. And the defendant, still not allowed to speak, was being tried in the court of perception before she ever got a chance in the court of law. And in that moment, Jasmine understood exactly what kind of war she had walked into. This wasn't a search for truth. This was a staged execution. Jasmine stood slowly, the weight of silence pressing against her back like 1,000 eyes. She didn't rush. Her hands were steady, her breath controlled, her mind already 3 steps ahead. In one hand, she held a file, neatly assembled, color-coded tabs sticking out like signposts of preparation. She knew the importance of every line inside it, legal precedent, transcript excerpts, witness notes. It wasn't just paper, it was her defense, her shield, her only weapon in a courtroom that had already turned hostile. She raised it gently as she stepped toward the lectern. "Your Honor," she began, voice calm but deliberate, "I have documentation that—" Judge Grayson didn't even let her finish the sentence. His voice sliced through the air, loud enough to make a reporter drop her pen. "Miss Crockett, this is a courtroom, not a stage for political performance. If you think this is your moment for television soundbites, I suggest you rethink your strategy." The gavel wasn't needed. His tone carried more weight than wood on steel. Murmurs spread across the gallery like wind rustling through dry leaves, some stunned, others smirking. Jasmine didn't blink. She stood her ground, file still raised, eyes unshaken. "Your Honor," she said, her tone respectful but unyielding, "I am exercising my right as a defendant to present material evidence relevant to my case. I am not performing, I am defending." For a moment, time seemed to pause. Grayson stared at her like she had just insulted the court's very foundation. His jaw clenched. His pen stopped moving. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Then, without warning, he slammed the gavel down with explosive force. $1,000 contempt of court, he snapped, "for your tone, your presumption, and your clear misunderstanding of how this courtroom operates. I will not be lectured by someone who hasn't earned the right to address this bench like an equal." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Someone in the back muttered, "That's outrageous," but no one dared speak louder. Even the court clerk's fingers paused over the keyboard, frozen by the escalation. Jasmine's file trembled slightly in her hand, not from fear, but from the shock of just how openly the bias had been weaponized. She swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a line, her knuckles whitening around the folder. But she didn't step back, didn't flinch, didn't speak. Her eyes stayed locked on Grayson's, studying him, dissecting him, not like a student to a teacher, but like a soldier reading an enemy's next move. Grayson leaned back in his chair, exhaling like a man who believed he'd just put the world in order. His smirk returned, arrogant, dismissive. The kind of smile that says, "This is my courtroom. You're just noise." The courtroom murmured like a hive disturbed. "She's done," someone whispered behind cupped hands. "No chance." Not with him on the bench. The words weren't shouted, but they carried, sharp, certain, cruel. Eyes darted to Jasmine, searching for cracks in her armor, waiting for her to fold under the pressure. In the press row, a few seasoned journalists shifted uncomfortably. One reporter from Politico narrowed her eyes, muttering to her neighbor, "This isn't just bias. This is calculated." Another scribbled furiously in his notebook, but the line of his jaw said more than the ink. They saw it. Everyone saw it. The judge wasn't neutral. He was antagonistic. But none of them said a word on record. They simply watched as the courtroom became less about justice and more about dominance. And Jasmine sat at the center of it, the target of a performance masked as procedure. But what Grayson didn't see, what the cameras caught and the audience felt, was that Jasmine wasn't silenced. She was recording every word, every interruption, every petty humiliation, not with a phone, with memory, with intention, and with the quiet fury of someone who had just decided this fight wasn't about self-defense anymore. It was about exposing the system from the inside, and Grayson in that moment didn't realize he hadn't ended the fight. He'd ignited it. Jasmine rose slowly. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no permission asked. The room that had written her off minutes ago now felt strangely still, like it sensed something was shifting. She stepped forward, not with the trembling nerves of a defendant, but with the steady resolve of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do and dared anyone to stop her. Her voice rang out strong, low, unwavering. "Your Honor, I'm invoking my right to respond, clearly, factually, and within the bounds of the law." She didn't wait for an acknowledgement. She locked eyes with Grayson, her words slicing through the tension like a scalpel. New York Times, First Sullivan, 376 U.S. 254. The Supreme Court held that for a public figure to claim defamation, there must be proof of actual malice, that the statement was made knowingly false or with reckless disregard for the truth. She raised a single document from her folder, her press briefing transcript, and held it at shoulder height. "This was my statement. I referenced policy. I referenced budget allocations. I named no individual, no show, no personality. That is not malice. That is not personal. That is protected speech." Before the judge could interrupt, she took another step forward. The courtroom leaned in as her tone hardened. "Falwell v. Flint, 485 U.S. 46. The court reaffirmed that offensive expression, satire, or criticism, no matter how sharp, is constitutionally protected unless it contains provably false statements made with malicious intent." She tapped her transcript. "What I said may have provoked public debate, but provoking debate is not the same as defamation. In fact, provoking debate is the point of a free press. It's the point of democracy." She didn't breathe between thoughts now. She surged forward like a closing argument in a trial that suddenly felt much bigger than her. "And since this court has questioned my right to self-representation," she continued, her eyes narrowing, Ferretta v. California, 422 U.S. 806. The Supreme Court ruled that a defendant has the constitutional right to refuse counsel and represent themselves. That right is not subject to the court's approval. It does not depend on age, experience, or whether the judge thinks the defendant looks the part. She paused just long enough to let those words land, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small black audio recorder. Her movements were exact, almost surgical. She pressed play. Judge Grayson's voice echoed through the chamber. "Are you here with a lawyer's confidence, or just a little girl pretending at law?" The effect was immediate and devastating. A sharp inhale came from somewhere near the back of the room. A court reporter's hand froze mid-sentence. Even a bailiff shifted uneasily. Jasmine let the silence hang a moment longer before speaking again. This time slower, quieter, but with far more force. "That statement was made while court was in session. It was directed at me, on record, in front of witnesses. That is not impartiality. That is judicial contempt." The silence that followed Jasmine's statement felt like a held breath. Heavy, fragile, ready to snap. The recording still echoed faintly in the room, as if Grayson's own words were unwilling to disappear. Jasmine didn't let the tension fade. She stepped forward again, this time slower, more deliberate, her voice cutting through the stillness like the calm before a storm. "Now, Your Honor," she said, locking eyes with the bench, Let's talk about judicial responsibility. Her words landed with precision. According to 28 U.S. Code Section 455, a federal judge must disqualify themselves from any proceeding in which their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Not proven, not unanimously agreed upon, reasonably questioned. She let that phrase echo in the judge's own courtroom. It includes cases where a judge has shown personal bias or prejudice concerning a party, or personal knowledge of disputed evidentiary facts. She placed the printed statute on the defense table and slid it forward. That threshold has already been crossed. The moment you dismissed my legal standing as a little girl pretending at law, you made it clear this courtroom was never level. Her tone sharpened like drawn steel. This isn't just about ethics. This is federal law, and the law applies to the bench as much as it does to the accused. She didn't blink. I am officially requesting that you recuse yourself from this case under Judicial Code 455A, not because I'm afraid of facing trial, but because no American, regardless of age, gender, or political affiliation, should be forced to defend themselves in front of a judge who mocks them mid-proceeding. Her words weren't loud, but they were thunderous in intent. I don't need sympathy. I don't need favors. I need a courtroom that isn't poisoned before I even speak. She stepped back slowly, her shoulders squared, her presence now impossible to ignore. Around her the air changed, not with noise but with weight. The weight of truth laid bare in a place built to contain it. The fallout began slowly, like a crack forming beneath polished marble, barely noticeable at first but growing with every second. After Jasmine's bold invocation of Judicial Code Section 455 and the courtroom recording that shook the very pillars of decorum, the atmosphere inside the courthouse changed. What had once been smug silence now curdled into unease. Grayson's face lost color. His pen no longer moved. The gavel he'd once wielded like a weapon now sat untouched, as if even he knew it would only draw attention to the collapse. And outside the courtroom, the world had already noticed. Within 20 minutes of Jasmine's recording being heard, it hit the internet. A court staffer leaked the audio. Just 9 seconds of Judge Edward Grayson mocking her credentials. But it detonated across every media outlet like political dynamite. Twitter trended #RecuseGrayson. Legal watchdog groups issued emergency statements condemning his behavior. Even former federal judges called it an unforgivable breach of impartiality. The Judicial Oversight Council, typically slow and quiet in its processes, issued an official advisory citing the appearance of bias and recommending immediate recusal. The court was no longer isolated. It was exposed. Inside the chamber, Grayson returned from recess visibly shaken. His robe looked heavier. His gait had lost its certainty. He stood behind the bench, cleared his throat, and stared past Jasmine, as if avoiding her gaze might erase what had already been done. Due to recent public discourse and procedural advisories, he began, voice thinner than usual. I will be stepping aside from further proceedings in this matter. This is temporary, pending internal review. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't offer justification. He didn't apologize. He simply turned and walked off the bench. No gavel, no dignity, just the echo of worn leather shoes and a legacy crumbling in real time. The courtroom didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The silence that followed his exit said more than applause ever could. Then the door opened again, and the temperature in the room changed entirely. Judge Margaret Ellis entered not with flash, but with force. A woman in her early 60s, with steely gray eyes and a posture that conveyed absolute control, she moved with the kind of certainty that didn't seek approval. She had presided over national security leaks, interstate election disputes, and high-profile corruption trials. Cases where both sides accused her of bias, and both sides left respecting her verdict. Her record was spotless. Her courtroom was sacred. Her fairness was legendary. She took the bench without fanfare. No small talk, no glances toward the gallery. She opened the folder handed to her by the clerk, scanned it silently for 20 seconds, and then looked up. The room seemed to hold its breath. This court acknowledges the unusual procedural disruption that occurred under Judge Grayson's administration, she said, voice clear, firm, emotionless. However, this courtroom is not a stage for bias, nor a platform for public theater. It is a place where truth is tested, by law, by precedent, and by evidence. We will now proceed under those terms. All parties will be heard, fully, equally, and without interruption. The shift was immediate and visceral. The tension didn't vanish, but it recalibrated, from chaos to clarity. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't react. But her eyes, once sharp with defiance, now narrowed with something else entirely. Focus. For the first time since the trial began, she wasn't pushing against a wall. She was walking through a door. Not because the fight had ended, but because justice was finally in the room. And now, under the eye of a judge who had nothing to prove and everything to uphold, the real trial could begin. The courtroom had been reset, but not rewound. Grayson's shadow still lingered faintly, like the stale scent of a fire just extinguished. But the flames were gone. In their place stood Judge Margaret Ellis, cool, composed, and resolute. For the first time since the trial began, the air inside the chamber no longer felt like it was pressing against Jasmine. It was still. It was level. And as Ellis lifted her gaze from the bench, her words carried a clarity Grayson had never once offered. "Miss Crockett, you may now proceed. No condescension, no sarcasm, just the open door of due process." Jasmine stood immediately, not with hesitation, not with fanfare, but with precise intent. She stepped toward the lectern with her documents already in hand, posture tall, chin forward, like a soldier reporting for duty. Her voice, when it came, was razor sharp, each syllable deliberate and unshakable. "Your Honor, let's begin with the claim that my statement at the White House press briefing was defamatory. I present the full transcript of that event, alongside a verified audio recording." She held both up, walked them to the clerk's table, and continued without missing a beat. "At no point is the view mentioned. At no point is Ms. Goldberg named. The language used referred explicitly to publicly funded content and taxpayer accountability. A policy position, not a personal attack." She turned slightly toward the judge, locking eyes. "Any interpretation beyond that was projection, and projection, however loud, is not proof." Without waiting, she set down the next file, a thick folder lined with printed graphs, email chains, and Nielsen data. "Second," she said, "the plaintiff claims financial harm. Here is viewership data for The View over the past year. Ratings have been declining for 6 consecutive months, long before my briefing. The decline is consistent, predictable, and tied to network programming shifts, not my remarks." She tapped the folder once with a firm finger. "This isn't speculation. This is raw data, signed and certified." Then with measured calm, she reached for the final file, thinner but heavier in weight. "Third," she said, lifting it carefully, "I submit sworn affidavits from 3 individuals present during the briefing. 2 are credentialed journalists from separate national outlets. The third is a senior White House policy advisor." She handed the documents to the clerk, then faced the bench again. All 3 confirmed that my remarks were general in nature, targeted no individual, and aligned with internal talking points from the Office of Management and Budget. Her voice never faltered, but it deepened slightly with resolve. "This is not damage control. This is not spin. This is documentation. The very thing I was denied the right to present until now." She let the silence breathe. Judge Ellis gave a small nod. "All 3 exhibits are received," she said, flipping through the files with brisk precision. "They will be entered into the record and considered in full." Jasmine gave no smile, no sigh of relief. She simply held her ground, shoulders square, voice as sharp as ever. "The law protects citizens from targeted defamation. It does not protect public figures from discomfort over policy criticism, and it certainly does not allow a court to substitute assumption for evidence." Then came the moment no one expected, because it was so rare in courtrooms twisted by politics. Judge Ellis closed the folder, set her pen down, and leaned forward just enough to signal gravity. "Based on the clarity and strength of the materials presented," she said, voice cool but unmistakably firm, "this court will reopen the full scope of the case. Prior restrictions are lifted. All prior rulings are vacated. We begin again, from the law." A hushed gasp rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just procedural. This was a reset, a purge of bias, and a signal that justice had finally stepped into the room. Jasmine returned to her seat like a general retreating only after taking the hill. Her face didn't show triumph. It showed something harder, earned ground, strategic gain, a flicker of momentum in a war that had started with condescension and was now shifting inch by inch toward clarity. She didn't let her guard down, not for a second, but for the first time since walking into that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett was no longer fighting just to be heard. She was finally fighting from position, and the law was now walking beside her. This was the first peak of the climb, and she had reached it alone. Jasmine stepped out of the courtroom and into the long marble corridor like someone surfacing from deep water. Lungs full, back straight, but still bracing for another wave. The air outside felt different, cooler, emptier, as if the pressure had dropped. Staffers and reporters whispered at a distance, not daring to approach her now. She kept walking. Every step echoed off the stone floor, like punctuation in a chapter that had not ended, only paused. She turned the corner toward the elevators, eyes ahead, posture taut, and that's when the voice hit her from behind. Low, controlled, loaded. You really think the law can erase what I've lost? Jasmine stopped, not because she was afraid, but because she recognized the voice immediately. Whoopi Goldberg stood in the center of the corridor, arms folded, back straight, eyes locked. She wasn't flanked by press or lawyers now, just her. Stripped of the camera glare, the award shows, the talk show energy, there was nothing left but raw conviction and pain barely masked by anger. You think legal precedent can paper over humiliation? Whoopi continued, stepping closer. You think citing cases makes the headlines disappear? Makes the sponsors come back? You didn't say my name, no, but you let the world fill in the blanks, and they filled it with me. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She studied Whoopi in silence, not out of hesitation, but out of precision. This wasn't court anymore. No judge, no gavel, no transcripts. Just truth, exposed, unfiltered. When she did speak, her voice was iron flat, crisp as the legal briefs she'd fought to submit. The law isn't meant to heal feelings. That's not what it's built for. It's built to keep chaos in check. Because if we start treating emotions as evidence, then no one is safe, ever. She stepped forward too, now just a few feet from Whoopi. The hallway narrowed between them, not physically, but with the weight of everything unsaid. You talk about humiliation, Jasmine said, eyes never wavering. But I stood in there and was mocked by a judge before I said a single word. I was fined for asking to be heard. If the law didn't exist, that bias wouldn't just humiliate me, it would bury me. Whoopi's jaw clenched, but her gaze didn't falter. So this is all academic to you? Cold words and courtroom lines? Her voice dropped, quieter but more dangerous. You don't think what you said made people see me differently? Jasmine answered instantly. It's because of that fear of being seen differently that we need the law, not the crowd, not the outrage. The law. Because once we start letting reputations define truth instead of the other way around, we're no longer a nation of justice. We're just a nation of noise. There it was again. That unbearable silence, not empty, charged. Between them passed something harder than anger, understanding without agreement. Neither softened, neither apologized. But in that flicker of frozen time, something like mutual acknowledgement passed between two warriors who'd fought on opposite ends of the battlefield. Their scars were different, their weapons were different, but they had both shown up for the fight. Whoopi's mouth tensed like she might speak again, but instead she just nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Not in surrender, not in forgiveness, but in recognition. You're not weak, her eyes seemed to say, just on the other side. Jasmine didn't nod back. She didn't need to. She simply stepped past Whoopi, her heels clicking once more against the floor. Measured, steady, unbroken. And behind them the corridor held its breath. No press, no applause. Just the weight of two women who had collided not in volume, but in vision. Not a battle of words anymore. just a fracture in how they believed the world should work. She didn't rest. She didn't disappear into the media glow or ride the wave of public support. For Jasmine Crockett, the courtroom victory wasn't closure, it was ignition. The trial had exposed something deeper than just a biased judge. It had exposed a silent epidemic, a system where personal ideology wore the mask of legal authority, and no one, not the accused, not the press, not the people, had any real way to challenge it. That realization didn't haunt her. It drove her. 3 days after the verdict, Jasmine walked into the West Wing not as a press secretary, but as an architect of something no administration had dared attempt in a generation: national judicial reform. She entered the Roosevelt Room with a binder under her arm and fire in her bloodstream. Inside were senior legal advisors, DOJ liaisons, and political staffers, all expecting a debrief. What they got was a battle plan. She placed the binder at the center of the table and opened to the cover page. The title was simple, brutal, and impossible to ignore: Rebuilding Judicial Trust, a 3-point national initiative. Jasmine didn't ask to speak. She began. If a courtroom can't promise neutrality, then it can't promise justice. And if it can't promise justice, it's a threat to democracy, no matter who's wearing the robe. The first point hit like a cold plunge: mandatory implicit bias training for every sitting federal judge, including appellate and district courts. Not a one-time seminar, not a webinar to check a box. This is recurring, she explained, peer-reviewed and designed in conjunction with leading neuroscientists and legal scholars. Bias isn't always malicious, but it is always dangerous. And right now, we are pretending it doesn't exist on the bench. That ends here. Murmurs stirred. A DOJ official leaned forward. Jasmine, that will raise red flags with the judiciary. You'll trigger Article 3 backlash. She didn't flinch. Good. Let them respond. I'm not afraid of backlash. I'm afraid of silence. Then came point 2, the most controversial: the creation of an independent judicial oversight commission with full access to anonymized ruling databases, judicial conduct reports, and the power to flag patterns of ideological bias. I'm not talking about political witch hunts, she clarified, anticipating the storm. I'm talking about data-driven accountability. If a judge consistently rules against women in assault cases, or immigrants in asylum cases, or political dissidents in protest cases, someone should notice. Someone should be able to ask why. She placed a chart on the table showing the ruling trends of 3 unnamed judges. One had a 97% denial rate on civil rights motions. Another ruled against female plaintiffs in workplace discrimination cases 83% of the time. This isn't conjecture. This is math, she said flatly. And right now, we're ignoring it. The advisors were now sitting upright, papers rustling, tension mounting. A senior legal aide spoke carefully. That level of oversight could challenge judicial independence. Jasmine's answer was a quiet knife. Independence is not the same as immunity. No one elected them to be gods. They serve the people, and it's time the people had eyes on the bench. Then she opened to point 3, the final and most public-facing measure: a national, searchable database of judicial ethics complaints, including anonymized details, outcomes, and timestamps of all internal disciplinary actions. Right now, if you file an ethics complaint against a federal judge, it disappears behind the curtain, sealed, hidden, silenced. We're handing lifetime authority to people who can be as biased, as prejudiced, and as political as anyone else. But we've stripped the public of the right to see it. She paused, letting the truth sink in. This isn't about punishing judges. It's about protecting trust. And we don't protect trust with silence. We protect it with transparency. A long silence followed. No one moved, no one challenged, but no one applauded either. Because what Jasmine had laid out wasn't just bold, it was dangerous, politically dangerous, institutionally dangerous. It asked the nation to look directly at the thing it feared the most: that justice might not be blind but selective, and that its arbiters might be swayed not by law, but by legacy, ego, or ideology. Jasmine stood tall, hands resting on the binder, eyes scanning the room. You told me not to fight this case. You told me to settle, to back down, to wait for the storm to pass. She leaned in, voice low and lethal. I didn't back down. And now I'm telling you this. If we don't fix the system that allowed that courtroom to happen in the first place, then everything we say about freedom, about fairness, about democracy is just a slogan. And I'm not here to manage slogans. I'm here to fix what's broken. She didn't wait for permission. She walked out of the room the way she'd walked into court, alone, determined, unshakable. Outside, a journalist caught a whisper of her proposal and tweeted a headline that would explode within the hour. Jasmine Crockett proposes historic overhaul of judicial ethics system. Silence is no longer an option. By sundown, every network had it on loop. The trial had ended, but Jasmine's war for justice had just begun. The auditorium lights hummed softly above the stage, casting long shadows over rows of judges, legal scholars, policy advisors, and law students. The event was billed modestly, modernizing judicial integrity in the 21st century. Most had expected another routine conference, panels, jargon, polite applause. But as Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, the room was anything but routine. Her words were deliberate, her delivery surgical. She wasn't appealing to emotion, she was dismantling inertia. What happened in courtroom 4A wasn't an anomaly, she told them, voice steady. It was a symptom of a deeper disease, one where tradition has become a shield against responsibility. She clicked her remote. A chart lit up behind her, showing a sharp decline in public trust in the judiciary over the last 10 years. She didn't flinch. And when people lose faith in justice, she continued, they stop obeying it. They stop believing it protects them. That's when democracy bleeds from the inside out. The audience was silent, not disengaged, but shaken. Then it happened. A quiet stir at the back of the room. The doors opened. Not with drama, not with fanfare, but with the kind of hush that signals something real is about to happen. Edward Grayson stepped into the auditorium, dressed in a dark suit with no robe, no escort, no defense. Just him, and the weight of everything that had brought him there. A few heads turned, then more. A collective intake of breath swept through the audience like wind brushing a dry field. He didn't hesitate. He walked down the center aisle, every step echoing against the stone floor louder than the last. And Jasmine, already off stage, watching from the wings, didn't blink. Grayson ascended the stage alone. No notes, no papers. He reached the microphone, adjusted it once, and spoke with a voice stripped of its old steel. I was wrong. The words fell like iron on concrete, loud in their simplicity, devastating in their honesty. I mocked a young woman because I thought the courtroom was mine to command, he said, his voice lower now, slower. Because I mistook age for ignorance. Because I allowed my politics to speak louder than my professionalism. And in doing so, I corrupted the bench I swore to uphold. You could have heard a pin drop. This isn't about optics, he said. It's about truth. And truth only matters when we're willing to say it out loud, even when it ruins us. His eyes, once icy and unreadable, now flicked to Jasmine standing just off stage. She came to court alone. I had 30 years of robes and reverence, but she had one thing I lost a long time ago, the courage to confront the system from inside it. Then he paused. His voice softened, but his posture remained firm. That's why I resigned. The air was electric, not applause, stillness. The kind of stillness that only follows the rarest sound of all, accountability. Grayson didn't smile. He didn't wait for reaction. He stepped back from the microphone, nodded once, and descended the stage as quietly as he had entered. But the impact was seismic. By morning, the video had been clipped and broadcast across the country. Headlines read, "Disgraced federal judge confesses bias at Integrity Summit." Crockett's reforms gain momentum after Grayson's public admission. A courtroom battle becomes a movement. Within a week, Texas, Ohio, and Arizona all announced legislation mirroring Jasmine's initiative. Mandatory bias and empathy training for judges. Independent oversight councils with access to anonymized decision databases. Public dashboards for judicial ethics complaints. It wasn't symbolic, it was actionable. In Ohio, the Chief Justice called it the most significant structural reform since the state constitution was amended. In Texas, the bipartisan vote stunned both chambers. Even skeptics were caught off guard. A conservative columnist wrote, "Crockett turned a courtroom ambush into a constitutional reckoning." A progressive law professor posted, "She forced a system designed to resist change to change anyway." Jasmine never claimed victory. She never stood behind a banner. She simply went back to work, writing draft policies, coordinating with legal scholars, and appearing at state forums where judges asked her the very questions they once ignored. How do we recognize our own bias? How do we rebuild public trust? What happens next? She never said, "I told you so." Instead, she said, "What happened to me can happen to anyone." That's why we build safeguards for the next voice that doesn't have a microphone, for the next citizen who walks into court alone. This was no longer just her personal high point. The sine wave of Jasmine's story didn't peak at vindication. It climbed higher, into transformation. Her scars weren't erased, but they became blueprints, carved into a system now forced to confront itself. And from that confrontation, a new standard was born. The lecture hall at Yale Law School had seen its share of dignitaries, scholars, even former presidents. But on this particular evening, it was Jasmine Crockett they had come to hear, the woman who walked into court alone and left with the nation's judicial system rethinking itself. Students packed every bench. Some stood shoulder to shoulder in the back. A few, too late to get inside, watched from monitors in the overflow room. Faculty members who once dismissed her as too political for legal purity now sat in silence, waiting. Not for drama, not for spectacle, for answers. Jasmine didn't wear anything fancy. A navy blazer over a plain white blouse. No jewelry, no fanfare. Just her binder, just her voice. She stood at the podium, took a moment to breathe, then looked out at the sea of anxious, intelligent, still idealistic faces. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice, but every word cut clean through the silence like a sharpened blade. I didn't walk into court with an army of lawyers. I didn't walk in with corporate sponsors or political donors. I walked in with one phone, one binder, and a refusal to lie about what I knew to be true. A few students shifted in their seats. She didn't blink. They laughed, they dismissed me, they fined me, but what they didn't do was stop me. Applause rose, but she held up a hand firm and fast. Not yet. You think justice is something you argue for when the system is ready to hear it, but I'm here to tell you, the system is never ready. You don't wait until you're qualified to speak truth. You speak it, then you become qualified. That's how reform works. That's how justice survives. Then she paused. Not for effect, to let it land. I had a $1,000 fine and a courtroom of laughter. That's all. But I also had the law. The real law, not the one that flatters egos in black robes, but the one that stands even when the room turns against you. The applause this time was thunderous, spontaneous, raw. It wasn't hero worship, it was recognition. Students who had doubted her, who had argued about her in ethics class, now stood and clapped with the zeal of believers who had just seen proof that courage could make systems bend. But not all reactions came with praise. Back in her office the next morning, Jasmine sat quietly beneath two things pinned to her wall. One was the original 1,000 contempt fine, crisp, yellowing slightly at the edges, now framed in dark wood. A reminder that the price of being right is sometimes ridicule. The other was a letter, handwritten in blue ink on college-lined paper. No return address, just a name, Miguel Torres, second-year law student, Cleveland. My professors told me to pick my battles. You taught me to finish them. I grew up thinking the law was something that happened to people like me. Now I believe I can shape it. Thank you, Jasmine read it 3 times before pinning it beside the fine. 2 opposites, side by side. Penalty and purpose. That was her wall. That was her life. But outside that office, the narrative was already shifting. On social media, progressive pundits began to question her motivations. Jasmine's reforms are coded conservative maneuvers to control judicial narratives, one tweet read. Another called her a Trojan horse in a navy suit, and the term caught fire. Trojan reformer trended for 2 days. Protesters began appearing quietly at her events. Some held signs that read, "Reform, not rebrand," while others shouted across parking lots, "Tell the truth, Jasmine. Who paid for your podium?" The irony didn't escape her. She'd gone to court alone. No PACs, no donors, no consultants. But now the more she gained traction, the more the world demanded to believe she had power behind her. As if truth, spoken too clearly, must have a master somewhere. She didn't fire back. She didn't hold a press conference. But when asked in a quiet interview if she felt misunderstood, her answer was simple. "I didn't do this to be liked. I did it so the next person doesn't get buried under someone else's bias and call it law." But the pressure didn't let up. Newsrooms began publishing op-eds with titles like "Jasmine Crockett, Savior or Strategist," and "Is Judicial Reform Just the New Culture War?" For every student who wrote to thank her, another activist posted a thread accusing her of political disguise. She had cracked the system, but now the system, threatened and furious, had begun whispering about her instead of ignoring her. It was the downturn in her sine wave. Not collapse, not failure, but that moment when every victory invites a price. She knew the slope was coming. She welcomed it, because Jasmine understood something most of her critics didn't. You don't change a system by being everyone's hero. You change it by surviving the moment they try to make you the villain. Washington, D.C. was quiet, but not still. From the wide windows of her White House office, Jasmine Crockett stood looking out over the Capitol. The city shimmered in the blue-black cloak of midnight. Red tail lights crept like veins along Constitution Avenue, headlights cutting through the early fog. Above it all, the dome of the Capitol stood still, cold, almost indifferent. It was beautiful, but it wasn't comforting. Not tonight. Not after everything. She stood in silence, arms crossed lightly over her chest as the soft ticking of the wall clock measured out each passing second, like a judge tapping a gavel no one could see. Behind her, the room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of her desk lamp. The chaos of the past few weeks had settled into neat stacks, files sorted, binders labeled, articles clipped and highlighted. But one section of her desk remained untouched. A framed $1,000 fine receipt from courtroom 4A, and beside it, a folded letter in worn, creased paper. That was all. No trophies, no plaques, just two reminders of how far she had come and what it had cost. She reached for the phone lying face up beside them. The screen blinked. A single text from a senior White House advisor. "You just started a new war. Ready?" Jasmine didn't respond right away. She stared at the words, letting them sink in, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the gravity they deserved. A new war, not metaphor, not hyperbole, real systemic war, against a system that smiled on the surface but hid rot beneath robes and ritual. A war not just of laws, but of narratives, of power structures that did not want to be touched. And now they were staring back. She placed the phone down slowly, deliberately, like setting a chess piece back onto the board mid-game. She turned and walked toward the desk, each step soft but firm, like someone crossing an invisible threshold. Her fingers brushed the edge of the fine's frame, a piece of yellowed paper, thin, unassuming. But it represented the moment everything changed, when she had been publicly mocked, fined, silenced by a man in a robe who thought his gavel gave him the right to bury her voice. She left that courtroom not with shame, but with fire, and she had used that fire to burn through the illusion of judicial untouchability. Her name was cleared, the judge was gone, but justice was still in progress. Next to the frame, her fingers rested on the letter, folded 4 times, corners softened with time. The handwriting was rough, the ink slightly smudged. Miguel Torres, second-year law student, son of immigrants, first in his family to attend college, now studying constitutional law. He had written, "Because of you, I no longer believe the law is just for those who inherit it. I believe it's for those who are willing to fight for it." She had read those words on the flight back from Ohio and wept, not for herself, for what they meant. She walked back to the window. The lights below flickered. The city had no idea it was being watched by a woman who had stood in a courtroom and dismantled a 30-year veteran judge with a binder and a phone, who had stood alone in front of cameras, pundits, and protesters, not to win approval, but to defend the right to dissent without being crucified for it. And now that same city was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. There was no roadmap, no precedent, no committee vote that would clear the path ahead. Because no one had ever walked it quite like this before. Reforms had started, policies were moving, states were copying her proposal, but the attacks had begun too. Whispers in academic circles, accusations from political corners. She's rebranding conservative control, some said. She's too polished to be authentic, others claimed. They saw her strength as manipulation, her calm as calculation, and her refusal to lash out as evidence of a script. But Jasmine knew what they didn't. You can't fake scars, and hers were earned in silence, not spotlight. She had the receipts to prove it, literally. The fine, the transcript, the recording of Grayson's smirk. The moments where she had been told to sit down, to shut up, to play politics like a good soldier. She had refused, and in doing so, she hadn't just exposed bias. She had reminded people what courage under the rule of law was supposed to look like. Not grandstanding, not vengeance, but unflinching, lawful resistance. She whispered to herself now, as if needing to hear the words aloud. I didn't do this to be liked. I did it because it's right. The room held that sentence like a vow. She didn't need applause. She didn't crave the spotlight, but she knew she couldn't disappear either. The system she had rattled was already trying to recenter itself, to smooth the cracks, to pretend nothing had happened. Judges had begun privately calling her dangerous. Editorials were accusing her of turning the courts into a circus. Even some allies advised her to slow down, to let the dust settle. But Jasmine had no intention of slowing down. Dust only settles when the wind stops, and she was the wind. She turned toward her desk again and opened her laptop. The screen glowed to life, revealing a draft policy memo titled Phase 2, Public Accountability and Judicial Transparency. This one was bigger. It called for citizen reporting channels, AI-based pattern recognition in federal rulings, and open data sets for court performance across all 50 states. It was ambitious. It was controversial. It was necessary. She read through it again, tweaked a sentence, then another, then hit save. The time was 1:37 a.m. She hadn't slept in nearly 40 hours, but her body didn't feel it. Only her bones did. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't dull you, sharpens your resolve. Her father used to tell her, steel is forged when the heat is unbearable and the hammer never lets up. Well, the heat hadn't let up, and neither had the hammer. But somehow she was still here, still standing. A soft knock tapped at her door. A junior staffer peeked in, eyes wide, uncertain. Sorry, Ms. Crockett. Didn't realize you were still here. Jasmine smiled gently, waved him off. No problem. Go home, Tim. It's late. He hesitated, then left, the door shutting with a soft click behind him. She was alone again. Just her, the city, and the battle plans unfolding beneath her fingertips. Outside, the lights of D.C. blinked and shimmered, somewhere between defiance and fatigue, just like her. She could see the monuments, Lincoln, Jefferson, their marble reflections casting ghosts over the Potomac. They had fought different wars, but all wars for justice shared the same pattern: resistance, ridicule, and finally, if you stayed standing long enough, respect. The camera, if there had been one, would pull back slowly now, rising from behind her desk, capturing her silhouette against the full wall of glass, a lone figure in a fortress of power, but not powerful in the traditional sense, not the kind who wielded fear or commanded armies. She had only ever wielded one thing: truth. Truth, sharpened by law, carried with clarity, delivered without apology. And now, as the city breathed below her, Washington, D.C. didn't even realize the battle it once dismissed as a PR stunt had grown into a structural reckoning. She took one last glance at the letter, one last look at the fine, Two relics, two relics of war. Then she shut off the desk lamp, walked to the door and paused. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, once firmly, to no one in particular. The war wasn't over, but she was ready for the next round. And this time, the system was on notice. Justice had a new name, and it wasn't wearing a robe. Sometimes the most dangerous fight is not the one where fists are thrown or verdicts declared. It's the one where silence becomes a weapon, where power hides behind tradition, and where truth is twisted to sound like noise. Jasmine Crockett didn't enter that courtroom to make history. She entered it because she refused to apologize for speaking plainly, for calling a system what it had become, biased, brittle, and far too comfortable with protecting its own. And in doing so, she taught us something far more valuable than any court ruling ever could. That justice is not about who wins, but who refuses to be erased. The lesson wasn't in her victory, it was in her resistance. She stood, not because she expected to win, but because walking away would have meant surrendering the very principles that carried her into public service in the first place. It would have been easier to settle, to issue a soft apology, to let the machine churn and forget. But instead, she chose the hard path, the lonely one. And that's what real reform demands. Not popular heroes, but relentless voices who never back down, even when the system tries to crush them with silence and contempt. Because the truth is, Jasmine never stood a fair chance. Not with a judge who laughed at her law degree, not with a media echo chamber hungry for a scapegoat, not with a cultural landscape where every word she said was filtered through suspicion. But she stood anyway, and in doing so, she exposed a deeper flaw. When power becomes so insulated that it can mock dissent without consequence, then the system itself has stopped serving justice. It has begun protecting itself from it, and that should terrify all of us. This story wasn't about ideology. It wasn't about left or right. It was about voice versus volume. A young woman stood in the center of a courtroom meant to decide her fate, and instead of arguing for survival, she argued for truth. With her voice shaking but her spine straight, she reminded every witness, every student, every silent journalist in the room that the courtroom belongs to the law, not the loudest, not the most senior, not the most televised,